And now, President-elect Donald Trump has requested the U.S. Supreme Court to postpone an imminent TikTok ban while he works on a political resolution. His lawyer submitted a legal brief with the court on Friday stating that Trump opposes banning TikTok and seeks the ability to resolve the issues at hand through political means once he takes office. On January 10, the court will hear arguments on U.S. legislation requiring TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance to sell the social media platform to an American corporation or risk a ban on January 19, the day before Trump takes office. U.S. authorities and politicians have accused ByteDance of being related to the Chinese government, which the company rejects. Let's now have Errol Morkoc join us to discuss the Georgia crisis and the possible ban of TikTok on January 19, just before President-elect Donald Trump takes office. Errol Morkoc, is good to have you. He is a Republican Party spokesman. Now,
yes, thank you for having me.
Right. Now, Georgia now has a new president, as you know, Mikhail Kavalishvili. The Biden administration on Friday sanctioned the founders of the Georgian Dream Party after the elections held in December. Now, what are the implications of the change on the U.S. government?
Well, it's going to be a very touch and go at the beginning. I mean, this is obviously a direct consequence of the failed Biden regime policy in Eastern Europe, as evidenced, of course, by the war in Ukraine and the general lack of confidence that has been building around the quality of the U.S. aid to ameliorate the Russian incursion. Now you have a situation where Georgia has been effectively lost again. And this happened, if you remember, under George Bush as well. And we put Mikhail Saakashvili in there, and he's now in prison. And so the fact that Russia has reasserted dominance over what has been historically in their sphere of influence, the old Warsaw Pact, doesn't surprise me. The question is, what is Donald Trump's administration going to be able to do about this? This is going to be an election that the leader will contain or be able to maintain his power through the Trump presidency. And as we know, Donald Trump and his administration is going to be looking for peace with Russia in regards to Ukraine. So, I mean, this as a bargaining chip can't be on the table there. And so there's very little that the United States is going to be able to do outside of, again, trying to do some sort of color revolution. They had the Rose Revolution, the nonviolent revolution that occurred. Obviously, it hasn't come to fruition. Right now, though, I think we've been forced on the sidelines. There's not a lot that the U.S. government can do that would have the support of the American people. Can we provide some financial support? Maybe. Can we perhaps dangle some re-entry into EU talks in the future? Yes. But in the short to medium term, this has been a great win for Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation, completely outmaneuvering the Biden administration, just as they outmaneuvered the Bush administration. So it remains to be seen what, if anything, Trump can do during these 4 years, because we're trying to be less of the world's police, less of a global hegemonic power, is the America First movement. And so to get involved in a place like Georgia in further detail is likely not going to be high up on the priority list.
The European talks, according to Prime Minister Irakli, are to continue in 2028 after being under Russian rule for over 4 years. Do you think a comeback to EU talks will be that easy?
No, I don't. And the reason not is because Russia is going to re-entrench itself in the political, economic, and societal fabric of Georgia, where they historically have always been. And while the Georgian people, like most freedom-loving people, would have a natural alignment with the West, the Biden administration has failed to defend those aspirations. And so, therefore, we have a very difficult time to potentially restart those talks without a lot of good faith. It's going to be, again, a situation where we have to start from scratch. Not a lot can be accomplished quickly, and I don't think it will be a speedy return to talks, if anything, because the EU can't trust the people they're dealing with won't be removed again by the Kremlin, effectively. And so it's going to be very tough to get those talks going again.
Now, I'm happy you mentioned the U.S. Talking about Biden. He's already, sanctioned the founders of the Georgian Dream Party. Does that have any influence? And I'm glad you mentioned Trump. Do you think Trump would take this up a notch? Is that something he can do coming in January 20?
Well, sanctions, as we've seen around the world, whether it be in Tehran or in Moscow, don't usually have the effective consequence. All it does is oftentimes turn the people further towards the autocratic dictator in charge, because he's able to turn and say, look what the Americans are doing to us. They're hampering our economy. they're not after me, they're after you. And so that's something that's very real problem there. Now, can Trump do anything? He could, but he would risk the peace deal that he's trying to put together in Ukraine with Vladimir Putin. So if that is to happen, if Donald Trump is to involve himself here, it would be towards, I would expect, the middle or the end of his presidency, because it's going to take a while to settle Ukraine, where over 1 million people have been killed. And I think that's going to be the focus, and the Russians are not going to allow there to be any bargaining. And if you do put sanctions on Georgia, Georgia's main trading partner is Russia, and Georgia gets all their resources from Russia, and Russia can easily support Georgia's, military and industrial base with their own resources. So it becomes a question of what can America offer besides replacing Russian hegemonic power there. And the Russians are there now. Donald Trump's a deal maker, and it's not a deal he's going to win. So I do not think there's much that he can do, or anybody can do, at least for the next 4 years, outside of military or excessive aggressive policies, which is the complete opposite of détente, which is where we're headed.
Now, before we move to Trump and TikTok, now talking about Morkoc again, the new president, many have questioned the qualification of the ex-soccer player. Georgia is guided by constitution, I believe, that states the qualifications for the presidency. Was that violated? And what does this mean for this new era with Georgians in Tbilisi?
Well, as far as the internal workings of Georgian politics, apparently they've been able to stay inside of the guidelines. I don't profess to be a complete expert on the vernacular of how they've chosen it. He certainly would not be a lot of people's first choice based on his qualifications. However, I do believe he has been able to ascend to the presidency. So whether it's correct or incorrect, the end result is that he is there. Now, what does that mean for Georgia? That probably means some isolation from Western banking systems, isolation from European trade. But it also could be a moment for Europe and the Americans to not be so hard-handed and perhaps cruel, and instead try to reach out and try to keep those trade lines open and try to win a soft power game of benevolence. And that, I think, is going to be the only way to keep Georgia engaged in the international community, because at the current moment, they are going to be effectively property of the Kremlin. And that is obviously not what anybody would be happy to hear.
So now let's go to Trump and the TikTok ban. This move by Trump to halt the ban on TikTok. I know there are issues with regards to TikTok and violence amongst teens and more in the US. Is this because he understands the influence social media has in this era? What's your take on this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, because Trump has gone back and forth on this, as well as most Republican voters in the country. At first, there was a lot of, let's say, China hysteria. They were saying, oh, the Chinese are showing their kids engineering and math, and they're showing our kids gang fights and crime. But the fact of the matter is, we have First Amendment in this country, freedom of speech. Donald Trump understands the power of social media. He also is the owner himself of a social media company. And social media has absolute immense public power over elections. And you saw Donald Trump utilizing TikTok to win over many young people, especially young men, in this last election. And people started to realize that banning TikTok was actually a Trojan horse against our Constitution, because then it sets a precedent that if we declare, oh, this platform is actually against the American state and it must be banned, then we're abrogating our own First Amendment. So it comes down to a situation of protecting the First Amendment and realizing that, hey, if your children are watching content that you don't think is good, that's the responsibility of the parent. Apathetic parents should not be allowed to abrogate the U.S. Constitution. So Donald Trump has actually flip-flopped and come back to what we think is the correct viewpoint: libertarian, free democracy of opinion. And yes, TikTok is a foreign-owned corporation, and perhaps they should be forced to maybe not send our data back to China, or there's stuff we can work with. But it's definitely going to be interesting, because as you saw, the Supreme Court will be ruling on this before Trump gets into office. So there has been a coordinated effort, I think, by the American, let's call it deep state, but you can call it whatever you want, to get TikTok out of America. First, the Democrats loved TikTok. That's what helped them. Barack Obama, before TikTok, dominated using social media, and they used all of these tools. And once the tools all of a sudden started to be used by the Republicans, then the Democrats got on board and the Republicans got off. So there is a little bit of horse trading and political gamesmanship. But as an American citizen, I think that it's important to protect the First Amendment above all else. And I think that's what Donald Trump is here to do. And letting a foreign entity control TikTok is a potentially threat, but it's not enough of a threat to abrogate our First Amendment.
All right, then. Thank you so much, Errol Morkoc, for joining us. Errol Morkoc is the Republican spokesman. Thank you for being on the Rise of America.